Great. My name is Maia Otarashvili. I am the Deputy Director of the Eurasia Program here at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and I am joined by a couple of my colleagues so we can talk about the changes in Russia's constitution. Chris Miller is the Director of the Eurasia Program here at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and he's also Assistant Professor at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. And Sarah Wilson Sokhey is Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Colorado. So I want us to jump right in and start talking about the constitutional changes that Russia has just passed. They were quite major. There are a lot of implications. And I want to turn to Chris and ask him to walk us through the highlights of this change. And then I will turn to Sarah to understand a little bit more about what it means for the future of Putin's rule inside Russia. So Chris, can you give us a bit of an overview of this new change in the constitution?
Great, thanks Maya, and welcome everyone. Excited to have this conversation today with Professor Sokhey and with you all. It's an interesting time to be discussing the constitutional changes because in some ways every month you discuss the changes have actually changed. Since the process was kicked off in January, we've seen multiple iterations from the Kremlin and the Russian elite in general in terms of explaining what the changes are actually about. And I think it's an interesting question to ask. Are these different iterations deliberate, or is in fact the Russian elite adjusting as they go, responding to both feedback from the domestic political system and also the external shocks of COVID and low oil prices, which I'm sure we'll dive into in great detail. But the broad context for the constitutional change, I think, is fairly straightforward. And the dilemma that the Kremlin faces is this. President Putin has been in power for now 2 decades, mostly as president, except for a short stint as prime minister when his deputy Dmitry Medvedev was named president. And he now faces a dilemma, which is that the current constitution prohibits presidents from serving more than 2 terms, and Putin is in the second of his 2 allotted terms under the current constitutional setup. So he had to decide what to do when the current term expires in 2024. He had no interest in retiring. The south of France wasn't for him. He has some nice dachas on the Black Sea coast, but none of them seemed nearly as appealing as life and power in the Kremlin. So he had to decide what to do when 2024 approached. And there were a couple of different options, I think, that were available. One was to try to assume a role of kingmaker behind the scenes. That was option number 1. Option number 2 was to again become the prime minister, which would have been allowed by the constitution while appointing a deputy as president, which had worked once before. A third option was to make himself president again by somehow changing the constitution. Or a fourth option was retirement, but for all the different reasons you can imagine, retirement wasn't appealing. And so the constitutional change process was, I think, an effort to deal with that dilemma. And when the changes were first announced, it wasn't at all clear that the final decision was going to be to keep Putin in the position of being able to run again for the presidency in 2024. When the changes were first announced, one of the most interesting changes that was proposed was to empower a body called the State Council, which exists currently, but it doesn't really have any sort of formal powers today. And so there were many people, myself included, who thought there was a reasonable chance that Putin would try to set himself up as chairman of the State Council and sort of wield power behind the throne and let one of his deputies become president. So that was one option. At the same time, the constitutional change appears to have slightly strengthened the role of the Security Council, which already is a very influential body in Russia, which includes Putin and many of his deputies. And so there was a possibility that Putin could have chaired the Security Council after leaving the presidency and playing a similar role as sort of kingmaker from behind the scenes. But several months ago, the Duma, in a surprise move to many, announced they were adding a new amendment to the constitutional changes, which would reset term limits. The logic being that because there's a new constitution, it makes sense to reset the 2-term limit. And this would allow Putin to run twice again for the presidency, all the way up until 2036, if he manages to live for that long and manage the elections as successfully as he's managed elections the past 20 years. And I think this was in some sense a surprise to many in the Russian political elite. In some ways, this is a pretty unsophisticated way of sticking around in power. He's sort of turning himself into an old Soviet-style dictator, setting himself up to be president until his mid-80s, and doing what he criticized the Soviet elite of doing, which is presiding over stagnation, not only in terms of the policies they're implementing, but actually the people themselves will, if he stays around until 2036, which I think is still a big if. If he does manage to pull that off, then he'll have been in power for approaching half a century. 36 years is an extraordinarily long period. And that too, I think, reminds many Russians of the late Soviet period when it seemed as the existing elites were in power and were never going to leave. So I think this is actually a not very elegant solution to the problem that Putin faced. And it's worth asking why he would have chosen such an inelegant solution when it seemed like there were more elegant solutions of wielding power from behind the throne. And he had multiple different pathways to do so. Either he didn't feel secure in one of those options, or he thought that the formal powers of the presidency as enumerated in the Constitution were important enough to keep his hands directly on. So it appears that the constitutional changes, now that they're formally passed, are setting himself up to become president of an additional time in 2024. Although it's worth noting as a conclusion that 2024 is a really long way away, especially in political terms. And I think although Putin has a long track record of winning elections through a combination of popularity and rigging, both of which have been historically quite important, it's far from guaranteed that he'll be able to pull off the same thing in 2024, given all of the expected and unexpected shocks that are likely to materialize before then. So I think although the constitutional changes are certainly designed to enable him to become president all the way until 2036, that's far from a guarantee that he'll be able to pull it off. Because if there's one thing we learn from studying succession processes in Russian history, is that they often come at surprising moments. And they're very difficult to predict when they materialize. And so I would hesitate to describe the constitutional changes as making Putin president for life, if only because we don't know how long he's going to live and we don't know what will come next in Russian politics.
Thank you, Chris. And this question of the future of Putin's role in Russia is something we've been grappling with within the Eurasia program for quite some time. So you and I were excited when we were invited to guest co-edit the summer issue of Orbis, and we decided to dedicate that issue to 20 years of Putinism, and we asked many of the contributors to also keep in mind how looking at those 20 years might be informing our understanding of what's coming, sort of Putin 3.0, if you will. And Sarah was kind enough to write quite an excellent article for us for this issue, which just came out, and I want to encourage everyone to take a look at it. Sarah has spent a lot of time studying Putin's social policy, which has greatly underpinned his popularity over the past couple of decades. And so I want to ask you, Sarah, to give us a bit of an overview how his social policy has helped him stay in power, but at the same time, what can we expect from Putin 3.0 in terms of his domestic policy, and will those old tricks still work?
Thank you very much, both Maia and Chris, for organizing this and for organizing the special issue of Orbis. So I think that that's an excellent question about how Putin has used social policy in the past and if his same tricks will work again. And Putin has promised a lot of things, and in the early 2000s, an important thing to remember is that he delivered on a fair number of things, or at least things got a lot better, is a good way to put it. Now, one of the things that goes along with that, which I'm sure we'll talk about today too, is that oil prices went up in the early 2000s and Russia got a lot more revenue, and they were able to finance better benefits. They could get pensions paid. They could make some improvements in social services. I say some improvements because there were still a lot of problems, but life got a lot better for a lot of Russians in the early 2000s. And so that was a big improvement. And one of the reasons that Putin was really popular in the early 2000s, he ushered in this period of stability and growth. He promised Russians a lot of things that he would, some of them at least, he was able to deliver on, and pensions is one of those big areas. Pensions sounds like a very niche area to talk about when we talk about Putin staying in power and his authoritarian strategy, but it's not really. Pensions have been a central part of Putin's strategy for staying in power. And so the honest answer to whether or not these tricks will continue to work is that we really don't know. It doesn't play well for the evening news and for a soundbite that the truth is, like Chris said, we'll know when it happens. Or we know the factors that make things more or less likely, and where the tensions are. We can tell what Putin is trying to do. Whether or not stagnating economic conditions and declining social services, because that's where we're at right now in Russia, whether or not those actually lead Putin to become unpopular and lose power, we're not going to really know that until it's happened. And no, until it happens, people will tell you as soon as it happens, everyone will have predicted it 5 minutes before it happened. But we don't really know if those same old strategies are going to work. What we do know is that Putin right now, and for the past, I would say, really since probably about 2008. So we're looking at about the past decade, they've promised a lot, but not had a lot of accountability for it and not delivered on a whole lot. So before every election, they promised to make healthcare better, education better, rural areas better, improve roads. They're going to protect the minimum wage. They're going to protect pensions. And then they fall flat on a lot of those promises. They do a little bit, and they do a little bit strategically right before they face an election, especially with pensions. It's a common strategy to just bump up the pensions a little bit before every single election, which has happened in the post-communist period. Both Yeltsin and Putin did that. And so that strategy might continue to work, but we're in a different environment now because there have been stagnating living standards and economic conditions. Oil prices are low. The COVID pandemic only exacerbates the challenges in the health infrastructure across Russia, the disparity between rural areas and urban areas. And the government doesn't have a lot of money, so we'll see what they can do. I think in a sense, Putin would like to do a lot of things, and it's a question of what he will be able to accomplish. And I should note too that there are many Russian politicians and bureaucrats, I think very well intentioned, or at least would like to improve conditions, but perhaps lack the state capacity to do it. They lack both the accountability, both the incentive to do it and the capacity to do it, and in some cases both. But that even if they'd like to, they're really constrained by economic conditions and the government revenue in the current climate.
Thank you, Sarah. So, Chris, diminishing living conditions are quite noticeable in Russia right now. And just like Sarah mentioned, between the pandemic and also this prediction that incomes will fall by about 5% this year, what does that mean to you? How does that matter, again, for regime stability going forward? And on top of that, I want to add, how do you think that will affect the parliamentary elections coming up next year? We know that that tends to cause a lot of uprisings, the local elections. So maybe you could comment on this combined effect of the low oil prices and the effects of COVID on living standards, the incomes.
Well, I think this living standard question is really the most important question in analyzing Russian domestic politics, and it's one of the hardest to grapple with. There's a number of different inputs into living standards. One is, Sarah mentioned, is social support from the government, which is absolutely crucial, especially for the elderly, but also more generally. And a second is the overall level of economic growth. And what you find over the past 20 years is that there's been basically two periods into which you can divide living standards. The first, which Sarah mentioned, was the first decade in which Putin was in power. Living standards grew extraordinarily rapidly, especially in comparison to the 1990s, which were for many Russians a period of economic suffering. In the 2000s, wages grew rapidly, pension payouts grew rapidly, and for almost all Russians, living standards were improving really quite drastically, depending on which metric you look at, by 5, 7, in some cases even 10% a year. So really substantial increases. Since that point, and especially after 2013, the situation has almost completely reversed. By the best metrics, since 2013, Russians have gotten poorer when you adjust for inflation. There's different ways you can run the numbers, but most of the numbers show a roughly similar story of stagnant, if not slightly declining, living standards. And it's not only the result of low oil prices. Oil prices have fluctuated during this period, some highs, some lows. It's not only the result of Western sanctions, although those certainly haven't helped the Russian economy grow. It's also more generally a lack of investment in the most important sectors of the Russian economy, and even sectors like oil and gas, I would argue, have been starved of useful investment and have been in some measure stagnating, certainly in terms of the efficiency at which they managed to produce oil and gas. And so this almost decade-long period of stagnation is something that hangs over Putin's popularity. And I think the big question that we have to grapple with as analysts is, when will it really put pressure on the political system? Because we've seen over the past couple of years and accelerating over the past 6 months, declining support registered in opinion polls for the Russian government in general, and even with a certain amount of delay for Putin in particular. But we haven't yet seen in a sort of sustained fashion a way that declining living standards translate into real popular pressure on the government to do something differently. Thus far, the protests that we've seen have been localized in specific regions. They've often been about specific issues, not necessarily living standards. Environmental issues are in many ways more likely to cause protest than living standards issues. And so there hasn't been a big social mobilization around living standards in a way that would affect policymakers. Everyone knows that people are unhappy about living standards. You can see it in the polls, but ultimately polls only matter if they get people out in the streets or voting in a serious way against the government, and that hasn't happened yet much at all. Now, there are a number of explanations as to why this might be. Some people say, well, the government's done a very good job mobilizing the population with its nationalistic foreign policy. Others say that the government is still able to say, well, it might be bad now, but it's better than it was in the 1990s. And depending on which metric you look at, that might be true. Certainly, it's a popular argument in Russia. But for whatever the reason, we haven't yet really seen an effect of declining living standards on political choices that the Kremlin faces. They don't really feel, I don't think, substantial pressure to do much about living standards, which I think explains a lot of why we get a situation that Sarah laid out, which are promises that are only partially fulfilled on. If the Kremlin felt pressured, they would fulfill the promises, but they know they can get by with a sort of 25% fulfillment, and it hasn't caused them any problems yet. The big question is, will this change? Will you get to a point where the populace starts pressuring the government to do something differently? If so, it would be a remarkable change in Russian politics, because right now the Kremlin can focus on a whole array of other issues. It can focus on elite politics, it can focus on foreign policy, it can basically ignore the domestic scene, or at least outsource it to domestic political managers in the Kremlin and in the political elite more generally. If that were to change, it would force a change in mindset in the Russian leadership more generally, and force them to focus on different issues than they have thus far. Now, one other thing worth noting is that almost all projections of Russia's economy over the next couple of years, and obviously projecting is very, very difficult, but by most projections, Russian living standards will continue to remain below their 2013 level for at least a couple more years. So probably by 2023, Russians will be poorer than they were in 2013. So a decade of declining living standards, which is a really poor economic record by any metric. And so the big question is, will that eventually lead to some sort of popular pressure on the government that forces the government to change its policies?
Thank you, Chris. And I think when we look back at the recent unrests and mass protests, it seems that the Russians are more willing to take it to the streets to protest against corrupt local officials, and they're less willing to sort of come out directly against Putin. I want to ask Sarah about the protests in Khabarovsk over this weekend, if that's connected to the constitutional reform at all, and also if you have any thoughts about the upcoming parliamentary elections.
I think the issue of the protests in Khabarovsk is really interesting, because there's a bigger political story going on here with the constitutional reforms or amendments that just got passed. And those protests, there have been two, to back up just a bit, there have been two big arrests recently. There's Safronov, the former journalist, who's been arrested with suspicions of, or the accusation is that he passed on information that he wasn't supposed to other people. And then the arrest of Sergei Furgal, of the governor of Khabarovsk, who was one of the very few governors of a region who was not a united Russia governor, and he had just won in 2018. He went into a runoff with a united Russia candidate for governor in 2018. He refused to step down in the runoff and serve as deputy prime minister. That was the offer, and has been referred to as the people's governor, was popular, and has been arrested for the accusations that he was connected to contract killings in 2004 and 2005. And so the past 2 days in Khabarovsk, we've seen mass protests. The numbers, I've seen estimates that vary from state-reported sources that say 500 people to Dozh is reporting like up to 35,000 people. So there's this huge, and I think the truth is probably more like the 5 to 10,000 number, probably is what most news reports seem to be saying. But this is an exception to what you were saying, in that you're right. There have not been a lot of protests against the national level, against Putin, but the Furgal arrest, we've seen 2 days of protests in Khabarovsk, in a region that's not seen big protests against the Kremlin. And so how does that tie in with the constitutional changes in the social policy? I think is the question here. And so Putin just had this constitutional reform. As Chris highlighted at the beginning, the big central thing for Putin was that he can reset his term limits and run again if he chooses in 2024. That's a long ways off. So we may see Putin not run again. And Putin has been a little bit coy, which is his general MO, about if he will actually run again in 2024. He just wants the option, right? So we'll see if he runs again in 2024. But he's gotten this constitutional reform. He can do that. And then, I don't think this is coincidental, that you've seen 2 high-profile arrests of potential, I don't know if political opponent is strong enough for Safronov, for the former journalist, but critics, at least, or people who are potentially not pro-Putin as much as he would like, or who are not pro-Putin. So you've seen these 2 big high-profile arrests right after he gets a constitutional reform to have the option to run again in 2024. I don't think that's coincidental, that he's cracking down right after that's happened. But the other piece of this puzzle is that we have to remember, with the constitutional amendments, those were bundled with 200 different changes, right? One of the changes was that Putin could reset his term limits and run again. But there's 200 amendments that the people voted on, and they voted as a package. They weren't able to vote individually on different issues. So Putin wanted to get this passed, so he bundled it with, they did things like, as a constitutional amendment, and this is extraordinary to me, that they have a constitutional amendment that they will guarantee an annual increase in pensions. So if you think about that for a moment, right, they're not just promising it, but they're putting it in the Constitution. Now, how you make that accountable and credible and follow through on that if you don't do it, I think there's a good question there. But they said things like, as a constitutional amendment, we will improve healthcare, we will improve education, we guarantee that there will be increased pensions. They also guaranteed that the minimum wage would be a living wage. Now, how you constitutionally guarantee that and enforce that, I don't know, but they promised all of these very populist things to get support for it. So I think all of this is a long-winded answer. I'm being a good academic here and giving the most long-winded answer possible. But the question of the protests and the referendum, it all goes together in a larger political strategy, and it all goes together with Putin getting this passed by including popular measures. And those popular measures were really important to include, because if you look at Levada survey data, Denis Volkov has been interviewed, he runs Levada, the survey organization, and Levada found that on its own, support for Putin getting a reset of his presidential terms was high, but it was at about 55%, not at the 70+% that Putin got in the constitutional referendum for the package of reforms. So if you hadn't, which suggests very strongly that if you hadn't included those popular measures, people may not have voted as much as they did for it, although the vote for the referendum is widely considered to be very, very fraudulent. So there's probably a lot of electoral fraud going on in different places. Some places have more than, at least one region had more than 100% turnout. Really incredible support for the new constitution. But to circle back to what you originally asked about with the protests, I think it's part of this both populist and traditional authoritarian crackdown. Sort of, I'm going to arrest big potential opponents, I'm going to promise people things they like, and I'm going to get a new constitutional referendum. Now, we have protests in Khabarovsk, which suggests that some Russians aren't totally buying this deal, but they don't all have to buy it. You just have to get enough people to buy the deal Putin's giving them for Putin 3.0 enough of the time. And he could stay in power for a good long while, even if there's protests in Khabarovsk, even if people aren't overwhelmingly in support of resetting his terms, which is why there is no, without sort of being, I don't know, having a crystal ball or something, there's no way to predict exactly when the breaking point comes. We can see possibilities for Putin losing popularity and power. But as Chris said, 2024, which is when Putin's current term is up, that's a lifetime in a political time. I mean, anything could happen in the next 4 years. So we really can't predict that far out. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Sarah. Speaking of anything could happen, COVID has thrown a major curveball into those plans. Even something as simple as having to reschedule, postpone the vote a few times, from first April to then May to now. Recently. I want to encourage our audience members to send in their questions through the chat feature, and I will do my best to get to your questions. But in the meantime, I want to ask each of you to tell us a little bit what you think of Putin's behavior and specifically his response to COVID, right? Because he's been a little bit mysterious or coy, like you said, Sarah. And I also want to ask Chris, how you see the economic implications of COVID specifically affecting Russia going forward, or their pandemic response. If you see that improving anytime soon, we're far from being out of trouble with COVID. So Sarah, I will turn to you first and then ask Chris to respond.
I think that the Russian government has really fallen flat on its response to COVID-19 and to the pandemic. So right now, Russia has reported more than 700,000 infections, more than 11,000 deaths. That is almost certainly underreported for a variety of reasons. One is that the testing is not happening enough, the testing is not happening at a good enough quality, and there are strong incentives for regional health officials to underreport or undertest for COVID numbers. And so Professor Judith Twigg, who's at Virginia Commonwealth University, has long written about the Russian healthcare system and has commented on the recent response and has noted this as well, that it's all set up for us to not know the real numbers. So it's probably quite bad. And we know it's quite bad, but we know it's also likely much worse than what we actually know. The post-Soviet response appears to the strategy appears to be to deny how serious it is, not just in Russia, but in some of the other countries. The extreme examples like Belarus, Lukashenko saying you can go to the sauna and take a shot of vodka and you'll cure COVID. And even Belarusians weren't buying it. They're not buying it, that this isn't serious. And in Russia, Putin has not been that glib about COVID by any means, and there are a lot of good efforts to address it. There have been lockdowns, but it's varied a lot based on where you are in Russia. Moscow had a pretty strict lockdown, but Moscow and Russia are opening up as COVID numbers are rising. And so they're allowing more travel around the country, and they're starting to open up international flights again as the COVID numbers are getting worse. So I think the response has really fallen flat there. I mean, it's worrying to me that I looked at these pictures of protests in Khabarovsk over the past 2 days, and almost no one's wearing a mask. Almost, I mean, a handful, I've seen, at least from the pictures I've seen, there's a handful of people, but almost no one is. So I don't think that it's been by any means a good enough response.
Chris, I'll turn to you.
Yeah, I would.
And I'll turn it over.
sorry, I would echo everything that Sarah said, and I think this is a great example of a sort of black swan that came out of nowhere from the Kremlin's perspective. They struggled to develop a response as to what to do, and one of the interesting, I think, effects of it has been not only the short-term epidemiological impact, but also the longer-term economic impact, because in some ways I think that will be just as serious for the Kremlin over the next 12, 18, 24 months. COVID had two main impacts on Russia economically. One was the effect of the lockdowns, which Sarah mentioned, which, like in all countries, slowed down economic activity in a really substantial way. The second, as important, was the decline in oil prices, which was due to people driving less all over the world. And so oil prices slumped the first couple months of the year and have only partially recovered since then. And for a country that relies very heavily on oil and gas exports, this is a really big problem. And I think this explains, or at least helps to explain, why the Russian government has done far, far less than most peer countries to address the economic effects of COVID on the populace. There's been a number of relief packages announced by the government, but if you look at actually the numbers involved, they're quite small, which is why living standards are going to fall so substantially this year. And so you might ask, well, why would it be that the Russian government wouldn't try to do more to address declining living standards amid a pandemic of the type we haven't seen in at least half a century, if not since 1918 and 1919? I think there are a couple of answers. One might be that, as we've discussed, the Russian government doesn't really think it has to do all that much with living standards because no one is pressuring them over the issue. But a second is that the Russian government has learned over the past decade or so that it's very important to have substantial financial reserves in case of future crises, whether foreign policy crises or economic crises. The Kremlin believes very strongly that reserves are something to be saved, not spent. And so you've actually seen the size of the National Welfare Fund, which is one of Russia's reserve funds, increase over the course of the first couple of months of this year, even amid a very severe economic downturn and a decline in oil prices. And so this is something that I think doesn't fit our normal theories of how governments operate. Every other government in the world is spending down its reserves and racking up debt as quickly as they can. Russia's being much, much more cautious on the economic front, trying to husband its reserves and make sure it can keep them in case of future shocks down the road. Now, this is a wise policy from the perspective of macroeconomic stability. It will ensure that Russia does have reserves for any future shocks, but for living standards, it's not a very helpful recipe. It will guarantee that living standards fall more than they otherwise would have this year, contributing to the social tensions that we've discussed earlier. Now, the big question for Russia, I think, is when does this all begin to return to something closer to normal? And Russia is in some ways as dependent as any country on the end of lockdowns and a return to normal consumption patterns, because the price of oil is so dependent on that variable. And so I imagine the economic policymakers in the finance ministry and the Ministry of Economic Development are rooting for lockdowns to end the world over so that they can get oil consumption higher and oil prices higher too. And so Russia is actually, I think, at a great risk in economic terms of a second wave, as well as being at risk in epidemiological terms.
Thank you, Chris. We're getting quite a few audience questions, and it seems like we cannot avoid a discussion about foreign policy, Russia's foreign policy. We have a question from Jeremiah Goodpaster. He wants to know, he says, since Putin has secured his future, as for now, what type of actions do you foresee Putin and the Russian government taking to shore up support? Could we see more military action in places like Georgia, or more open support in the Middle East? And I want to couple that with a question from Sylvia Baker, who wants to know how you see Russia's policy towards Ukraine, if that has changed recently, and what that might look like going forward. So I think these are really good questions. I'd love to hear your answers on this. Sarah, we can start with you and turn to Chris.
So I would be very hesitant to predict any particular future conflict and then have that be the sort of speculation on the record of where Russia becomes aggressive or militaristically involved next. But I think if we look to the past, then Putin has taken, especially in recent years, a rather aggressive foreign policy stance. And so the examples you cite in your question of countries like Russia has been involved in Georgia and in territorial disputes there. Of course, in Ukraine is the one that people most often think of currently, still involved in Syria. So I think there is absolutely the potential that there could be other conflicts that Russia becomes engaged in, but I think that there's a real risk of overextending themselves and overextending their resources. So as Chris noted, they already are holding back on spending that they could potentially be doing to offset the downturn, to offset declining living standards, to ameliorate the difference between the rural urban divide in Russia, which is significant. If you look at major urban hubs like Moscow and St. Petersburg and other major cities versus rural areas, the standards are very, very different in the standards of living. And they've been able to get away with not addressing that for a while. So engaging in these military pursuits is expensive, and it trades off with an accountability. And this is kind of a classic, sort of guns and butter choice of, like, you can choose to spend on sort of domestic social issues. You can choose to ramp up military spending and be engaged in different places. And if they don't feel that the expectation is very high or that they don't have to do very much domestically, then maybe they do continue to extend themselves. But I think that it's risky, and there's a limit to what they can truly afford to do. But they may push the bounds of how much they can do and how little they can provide domestically. To keep things going, and for Putin to keep a modicum of support. And I'll turn it over to Chris.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And if you look at the polling data on foreign policy, what you find is a substantial decline in enthusiasm across the board for Russia's foreign policy in general. Now, it's not as though that most Russians reject Putin's foreign policy, far from it, but the enthusiasm with which they embrace it has declined quite markedly, and you see a steady increase in the number of Russians who tell pollsters they think their government is focusing too much on foreign policy and not enough on domestic issues. Now, again, I think the question is, does this matter for Russian policymakers? And in the short term, the answer is probably not. The war in Syria, to give one example, has been a conflict that's been remarkably not resource intensive for the Russian government. It's not that expensive. It hasn't been that costly in terms of Russian lives. And so even if the Russian populace is unenthusiastic, or even if the populace turns against the war in Syria, it's not like the Soviet Union's war in Afghanistan that was creating a really substantial body count and turning the population to mobilize against the war. Far from it. I think most people are just uninterested and disengaged, which gives, I think, the Kremlin plenty of opportunity to pursue such conflicts if they so desire. Now, that's different than saying declining popularity will provoke the Russian government into starting a new conflict. I think I would agree with Sarah. It's very difficult to predict that might happen. It's certainly a possibility, but I think I would hesitate to even try to put a number on the likelihood that it were to happen, or to where it might be. I think it is worth noting, though, that if you look at Georgia, Ukraine, Syria, places where Russia is already engaged, none of these conflicts are over in any sense. In Syria, of course, there's still quite active fighting. In Ukraine, there's still regular shooting along the line of control. And in Georgia, the border of the territory that Russian forces control moves on a regular basis deeper into Georgian territory. So I don't think anyone would be surprised if any of these three conflicts heated up again at some point. Though I think it's very difficult to say that will be the Kremlin's preferred strategy for addressing domestic discontent. It could be, but it also could not be. These things are extraordinarily difficult to predict with any sort of accuracy.
And there could also be an argument that, at least in Georgia and in Ukraine, Russia is already positioned in a way that it does not need to go all in with a big armed conflict. It has quite a bit of military presence there, and most importantly, political leverage and control over the de facto government. So dialing up the heat is not a matter of starting a full-on war. It's a matter of just putting more pressure on those de facto governments. So I agree with you, Chris. A lot of our audience members are bringing up China. Bill Burnham and Nita Chuber, I'm so sorry if I mispronounce your last names. they've both sent in questions about China, whether it's about trade, if investments from China are helping supplement, offset the trade deficits with the US and the EU because of the sanctions regime, or also just sort of dealing with the rising power of China and how they perceive it. So there's quite a bit to discuss there regarding China. So I want to give each of you a chance. Chris, you just completed a book about Russia-China relations. So, you know, this is a huge topic that deserves its own event. So I want to give each of you a chance to sort of address this question in a way that you find most important.
Sure, I'm happy to start. I think the key thing with the Russia-China relationship is to understand what's driving it. And it's not primarily being driven by trade, by investment, by energy sales. It's being driven by foreign policy considerations, first of all. Both the Russian leadership and the Chinese leadership believe that they have a shared challenge. That challenges the United States and their allies. And so the reason that Russia and China cooperate the way that they do is because they have a shared foreign policy agenda of pushing back against the United States and trying to limit America's ability to pressure them. And so when you see Russia and China cooperating by holding joint military drills, by Russia selling advanced military equipment to China, by China co-investing along Russian tech firms in spheres such as facial recognition. This is all because both countries have broadly similar threat perceptions when it comes to the United States and feel like they benefit from cooperating against the US. And so that, I think, is the key driver of the relationship between the two countries. The economic relationship certainly has grown a lot over the past decade or so. Russia is now an important exporter of oil and gas to China, and it, like the rest of the world, finds itself buying an increasingly large share of its manufactured goods from China. But I think it's wrong to see this as a really important facet of the relationship. It's part of the relationship, but it's not driving the relationship in any substantial way. And I think it's worth noting the limits to the economic relationship as well, and the extent to which they haven't yet imposed limits on the diplomatic relationship. If you talk about Chinese investment into Russia, I think the striking thing is how little Chinese investment there has been. There's been some, but the Russian government has been cautious in letting Chinese firms invest in critical spheres such as energy. There's been some, but it's been limited and carefully circumscribed, I would argue. And outside of state-dominated spheres like energy, there's been far less private sector Chinese investment into the Russian private sector than Russia had hoped, for a variety of reasons. Sanctions is one. The poor investment climate in Russia is probably an even more important reason. So there were hopes over the past decade that China would come in and bail out the Russian economy by investing heavily, and that just hasn't really happened. But despite that, the political relationship is as strong as ever. Xi Jinping last year described Vladimir Putin as his best friend, which might be a slight overstatement, but I think is a broadly accurate description of where the relationship is right now, which isn't to say that it's perfect. There are a lot of different places where the two countries experience friction. I think it's interesting to look at the India-China border dispute a month ago and think about how does Russia interpret what happened there. The Russian government has been very, very proper in its response, saying that it has no official position, calling on both sides to de-escalate. But the Russian media has generally reported the event as an example of Chinese aggression against India, which I think suggests that the median view in the Russian elite is that China is in the wrong and India is in the right, which I think provides some reason for caution among Russians in terms of getting too deep in the relationship with China. But I think it'd be wrong to expect any big changes in the relationship so long as the number one foreign policy challenge faced by both countries is the same, and that's the United States.
Sarah, let's turn to you on Russia-China relations.
Yeah, so actually, if it's all right, I think I'll focus on a slightly different aspect of one of the questions that I see in the chat, which is related to this. But there's a question from Sudarshan Gupta about if the new constitutional reforms could create a stability that would be good for US-Russia relations, which would be important given a rising power of China. I think Chris did a very good job answering the Russia-China question. And so but I think I thought that was an interesting comment about how the new constitutional reform provides a certain stability, and could that improve US-Russian relations? And it's an interesting question because in a sense, even an authoritarian leader, if there's a stability, if other governments know that leader will be in power, then even if it's not a very democratic leader, perhaps that provides the potential for improving relations because you know who you're doing business with, I think would be sort of part of the argument. And I think that there's a possibility there in that sense. There's obviously some big sticking points in US-Russian relations, obvious ones being the possibility of some sort of bounty being put on American soldiers in Afghanistan is a big issue that has to be resolved in some way. The possibility or evidence that Russian agents were involved in the 2016 election or in interfering in media reports and sort of spreading news stories that are not correct. That these are big issues, but that if we know it's sort of Putin moving forward, and it does look like, unless something big and unexpected happens, that Putin will be in place, especially with this constitutional reform, that maybe there is the possibility of building on common areas, which very much still exist between the US and Russia, like common areas of shared interests and shared goals in the world, that maybe there's the possibility of that. Because at least if we know it's Putin, we know who we're doing business with. It's a bit of a cynical, maybe sort of resigned stance, but a very practical one, perhaps.
That's very interesting. I also want to turn to a question from Brett Howard from CNBC. He wants to know, does Putin have a long-term strategy to diversify the economy away from energy export dependence? And is that strategy feasible? Will this constitutional change, which promises many aspirational advantages for Russian citizens, like Sarah mentioned, end up backfiring if those gains don't materialize? Chris, do you want to take this one?
Sure. I think if you look at the question of diversification, what you can find is that over the past 2 decades, on an almost annual basis, the Russian government issues a new strategy document describing all of its efforts to diversify. And the net effect of all these efforts is pretty much close to zero. And so I would discount extraordinarily heavily any promises to diversify in the future, just because in the past, they haven't worked at all. And the reason they haven't worked, I think, is because for the Russian government's perspective, the existing economic structure works reasonably well for them. Oil and gas have proven easy industries to control. They produce a whole lot of revenue that the government finds it easy to tax. The Russian government either directly owns or owns through oligarchs who have been tamed by the Kremlin, the entire energy industry in Russia. And so diversifying away from energy actually creates, I think, political risks that the Kremlin would just rather not deal with. And I think the other factor that's important to note is one of the reasons you might diversify is if you thought that economic growth was an important problem or living standards were an important problem that you wanted to deal with. But as we've discussed earlier, that's not really a priority in the Kremlin. It sounds somewhat strange to say in comparison to Western governments, which are constantly focused on living standards and economic growth. And it's the economy is stupid is sort of the mantra of almost all politicians. But in Russia, that hasn't empirically held true. You can ignore the economy, as the Russian government has for the past 10 years, and do perfectly fine as a political leader, at least thus far. And so I think so long as the political leaders in the Kremlin conclude, as they have, that economic stagnation is perfectly compatible with their continued rule, they have no incentive to spend any time thinking about diversification at all.
Thank you. I do want to turn back to this question of US-Russia relations, and not just US-Russia relations, but Russia-Europe as well. We've seen a bit of thawing there with France and Germany, and we remain at a standstill with Russia and the US. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how you see the future of, again, with Putin 3.0. What do you think are some of the scenarios of this situation changing, again, between Russia and Europe and Russia and the US as well? We can start with Sarah and then turn to Chris, maybe, because I wonder if there may be some divergence on your perceptions here.
So I do think that it's possible for US-Russia relations to improve because certainly US-Russia relations have gone through a whole gamut of up and down over the decades. And yeah, so I think moving forward, it is entirely possible that I noticed this in the comments from Silva Baker. I do think it's possible that the US would look for a common ground with Russia. I think that that's in the realm of the possible, is what I would say. Now, is it going to be very challenging in the current moment? I think that that's absolutely true, right? Because if both countries have the sense that the other is trying to interfere in their domestic politics, then that makes it very problematic to move forward. But when you had sort of former ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, you had people who were looking to reset, looking to find common ground. Like there is certainly the possibility of that changing. A lot will depend on elections in Western countries as well. So, I mean, of course, the US has a big election coming up in the fall. And so a lot depends on what happens with those for US-Russia relations going forward. I was going to circle back really quickly to the issue of like expectations and, you know, the Kremlin is promising all of these things, and will Russians really get upset if they're not delivered? I really think that a key thing to emphasize here is that Russians' expectations for what the government will actually do may be quite low, and survey evidence bears this out, that their expectations, there's a difference between what they think the government should do and what the government actually will do. And if your expectations for what the government will actually do are quite low, then providing 25% of your promises looks pretty good, right? If you promise 100 schools and you provide 25, hey, it's still more schools, right? And so that's where we need more serious survey work to know maybe where that tipping point is into like, how much can they underdeliver before people are really upset? And they've played that line very well and successfully for a long time of giving just enough that they can keep a modicum of support. People aren't too upset, right? But I think my strong suspicion is that they can under-provide for a long time and get away with it.
Overpromise, under-deliver.
You might want to go back to US-Russia relations.
Right, overpromise, under-deliver, and still exceed expectations. It's
we know if the Kremlin's social strategy is to overpromise is it underpromise and overdeliver, or overpromise and underdeliver? I think with U.S.-Russia relations, it's definitely overpromising and underdelivering too. If you look at, there's an excellent book by a scholar named Angela Stent, who is a real expert in U.S.-Russian relations, who analyzes all of the U.S. presidents since the end of the Cold War. And what she found, and she wrote this book before President Trump, but it fits his administration perfectly too. What she found is that every U.S. president comes to power convinced they can reset the U.S.-Russia relationship. The reset is a phrase that we associate with Obama, but in fact, the concept is something that every president has done. You see President Trump trying the same thing, and like all of his predecessors, largely failing to deliver. I think there's going to be, in the Biden administration, at least some people, if there is a Biden administration, pushing for a similar reset. If the Trump administration continues for 4 more years, I wouldn't be surprised if you had renewed efforts for a reset. This is sort of an enduring feature of U.S. foreign policy. And it is a situation of overpromising and underdelivering, because the delivery has always been really quite low for a variety of reasons. I think there's plenty of overoptimism on the U.S. side, and I think there are plenty of structural factors, just deep disagreements in how U.S. and Russian leaders see the world, that make any sort of improved relations extraordinarily difficult. So I would expect overpromise and underdeliver to mark U.S.-Russian relations over the next 4 years, regardless of who is president. Actually, I think President Trump would likely try to reinvigorate his efforts to befriend President Putin if he had a second term, and President Biden, if he were to be elected in November. But I think actually, despite the extensive criticism that his team has given to President Trump for being too close to Russia, I think there's actually some voices close to him that would like to try again to improve relations with Russia, or at least set the relationship on a more stable footing. And I think that would be a very difficult endeavor for them as well. So I think perhaps slightly more pessimistic than Sarah is on the future of the relationship, just because resets have been tried so many times and have failed so many times that I hesitate to see much scope for optimism about any sort of improvement in U.S.-Russian ties.
Chris, Sarah mentioned areas of common interest and potential collaboration between Russia and the U.S. Can you comment on that? What would those areas be, if you see any, from your own perspective?
Well, people who try to identify common interest often point to counterterrorism as one place where the U.S. and Russia have some common interests, although it's worth noting that in Syria, the U.S. and Russia have very different definitions of who is a terrorist, and have been attacking each other's groups that some claim aren't terrorists and others are. People often point to North Korea and the Iranian nuclear programs as areas where there's some common interests, although I think when you dig deeper, the scope of agreement is actually relatively narrow on both of those issues as well, and there's a lot of disagreement as well as agreement. Beyond that, I think it's hard to envision a shared agenda. In the past, people would talk about trade or economic issues as being a scope of shared agreement, but in fact, you see both the US and Russia imposing sanctions on each other because of foreign policy disagreements. So it's hard for me to see increasing trade as in the interest of either side, so long as they both have sanctions imposed on the other. In the past, there's been discussion about space as an area of agreement between the two countries. But in fact, there's deep fears both within the Russian and the US military about the other's space capabilities in a military sense too. So there's plenty of voices saying we should not cooperate on space, probably more than there are saying that we ought to cooperate in space. So I think all of the areas where you see discussions of potential shared interests, when you dig deeper, the scope for agreement is actually much smaller than you would think. And I think the key driver for this is that both in the United States and in Russia, the dominant view among foreign policymakers is that it's most likely that the other country will remain a threat over the long term. And so the goal, often not directly stated, but I think the goal of policy is more often to weaken the other power rather than to find scope for cooperation. And so as long as the US remains focused on weakening the foundations of Russian power and Russia remains focused on weakening the foundations of US power, agreement is probably the wrong metric for thinking about the relationship because both sides are trying to undermine the other.
That's very interesting. As I mentioned earlier, so we know the situation with the sanctions from the US side. I mean, they've been put into the law essentially, so we don't need to worry about the sanctions going away overnight. But the situation is a little bit different with Europe. And like I mentioned earlier, we've seen some of the Western European countries even attempt a bit of a reset with Russia. Can you comment a little bit more about Russia's relations with the European nations, especially when it comes to energy trade? And do you think there are any do we have any issues to keep in mind when it comes to European sanctions on Russia? Sarah, I can turn to you if you want to comment first.
Sure, I'm definitely a bit more optimistic about U.S.-Russia relations having the possibility. I would emphasize that the possibility of improving, simply because looking historically, we've gone through ebbs and flows. Now it's complicated, and it's more than just finding common ground, because not only do we have to have common ground, we have to have the right domestic conditions in both countries for that to happen. So if you look even not that far back, in the 1990s, US-Russia relations were much better in some aspects, at least, in a lot of aspects, than they are in the 2000s. Now, because Putin is going to be in power and because of the nature of domestic politics in Russia and the nature of domestic politics in the US, it's going to be very challenging for US-Russia relations to improve in the immediate term. But I absolutely think the two countries have shared common ground that they could use potentially to improve relations in the long term. Now, for the question of Europe, which is what Maia just asked about, and energy relations with Europe, this is an area where I'm going to go full in on the optimism here. Russia has used energy politics as a tool of leverage with other countries. They've cut off natural gas during the winter to certain countries when they've had price disputes, when they've had political disputes. There have been concerns in Europe about the natural gas that comes from Russia into European countries and the leverage that gives Russia. But I'm going to go full in on the optimism here, in that I think that gives both sides an incentive potentially, if they can, to cooperate in ways that could be productive. I'm hedging this as much as I can because I recognize that it can go in a bad direction, very much so. But in that Russia wants to sell its oil and natural gas. Low oil prices are very bad for Russia. We're talking more about the broader energy spectrum, natural gas as well. They want to sell it, and European countries want to buy it. And so there could potentially be a reason to at least figure out a good way to coexist there without either side having to have really great motives as far as like they can be purely strategic political motives, right? And there could still be, that could create an incentive for better cooperation. But the other side of that is absolutely that it creates the potential for bad disputes, right? That maybe Russia plays even more hardball on natural gas disputes because oil prices are low and because they want to make more money there. Or if they don't want to militarily intervene somewhere, maybe they use that as leverage. And I saw a question in the comments about the climate change issue and Putin 3.0. Climate change, along with these energy issues, creates a really complicated web of problems that have to be addressed as well. I'll go ahead and stop there and turn it over to Chris in case he'd like to add to this.
Thank you.
Well, I think energy politics are a complicated issue because they're a sphere of both deep cooperation between Europe and Russia and also almost constant disagreement. The cooperation is the massive volumes of especially gas, but also to a certain extent oil that Europe buys from Russia and has bought for decades now. And the disagreement is the on-running disputes over price and supply provisions that have also been going on for decades as well. And so in some ways, the current status quo of immense economic interdependence between Europe and Russia and constant disputes and accusations from both sides is sort of normal for EU-Russian relations. And so I see it as actually kind of a more stable equilibrium than a quick glance at the newspaper headlines might suggest, since both sides are used to this status quo. I think the one thing that does stand out about European policies towards Russia, and I know we're running low on time, so I'll be quick in this, is that although there's constant discussion in Europe about when Europe is going to start going softer on Russia, in fact, European policy over the past 6 years since the annexation of Crimea has been remarkably steady. It's been less hawkish than some in the US have wanted. It's been more hawkish than many in Southern Europe would have wanted, but it's actually been fairly steady despite many debates and disputes within the European Union. Sanctions that the EU has imposed on Russia have been in place now for 6 years. There was basically no debate within the EU about extending them when they were last extended for 6 more months earlier this year. And so in some ways, I'm actually impressed by the continuity of European policies towards Russia, even amid ongoing debates both within Europe, between Europe and the United States, and also between Europe and Russia. It's the continuity that stands out the most to me.
Thank you, Chris. Unfortunately, we're out of time, so I want to thank you both, Chris, Sarah, for this really interesting discussion. I'm sorry to everyone whose questions we didn't have a chance to get to, but I will share those questions with our speakers to see if they might inspire some upcoming articles. Speaking of upcoming articles, you can always go on FPRI.org to check out some of our research on Eurasia and on Russia and read some of these really excellent articles that are part of the summer issue of Orbis, which is out now. And you can also go on our website to support FPRI to become a member or a donor. And we very much appreciate your time and your participation, not just in today's discussion, but in general, especially during such uncertain times like this shutdown we've been experiencing, but managing quite swimmingly because, again, we have the benefit of things like Zoom and quite a robust web presence that FPRI has. So thank you, Chris, thank you, Sarah, and thank you to our audience, and we will continue this conversation offline.